The warm welcome housing associations gave Theresa May on Wednesday should not have been a surprise. The Prime Minister popped into their annual conference en route for her Brexit meeting in Salzburg, promising housing associations £2 billion of jam tomorrow, in the form of longer-term funding for new developments, but not until 2022. Housing associations are desperate to build a closer relationship with the government after years in the cold, and May is equally desperate for a domestic policy that will provide some kind of relief from Brexit chaos. It is a relationship both sides need, and May certainly lavished praise on social housing on Wednesday in a way that was unthinkable just 6 years ago, when former Housing Secretary Grant Shapps called for social housing to be rebranded taxpayer-funded housing. The first signs of change in the government's attitude towards social housing came at this same conference 2 years ago, when then Housing Minister Gavin Barwell indicated a small but perceptible change in government policy, with an admission that affordable, sub-market renting is vital to help solve the country's housing crisis. On Wednesday, Barwell, now May's chief of staff, sat in the front row to hear her talk about the need to end stigma around social housing. May did acknowledge that part of this scorn for social housing came from her own predecessors. Government housing policy, particularly right to buy, has seen councils sell off huge swaths of social housing at a discount to former tenants without replacing it, creating an acute shortage of low-cost housing. What May failed to acknowledge, and made no promise to tackle, was the impact of welfare reform in exacerbating the housing crisis and helping to create levels of homelessness not seen in this country since the 1970s. It was only in December that MPs themselves pointed out that homelessness in the UK has more than doubled since 2011 and described the government's approach as an abject failure. Those words were echoed by Polly Neate, the chief executive of housing charity Shelter, who told delegates that unless welfare reform and the benefits cap were reversed, the county would see absolutely unacceptable levels of destitution. As for May's promise of £2 billion, housing experts were less than impressed. Former Housing Association Chief Executive Tom Murtha tweeted that people struggling on low incomes and benefits who are no longer able to access a decent home at a price they can really afford, need help now, not in 2022. Housing consultant Joe Halewood pointed out that £2 billion for the period of 2022 to 2028 is far lower than the funding housing associations were receiving from the government until it was slashed by George Osborne in 2010 to just £450 million a year. This new funding is 1/4 of that amount, and at £333 million per year is just 20% of the £1.68 billion housing funding the Tories inherited from Labour in 2010, he blogged. The shadow housing minister, John Healey, described it as housing on the never-never, while former Deputy Prime Minister Michael Heseltine was also deeply unimpressed. He called for the government to take an active approach to investment in homes and places through development corporations, telling The Guardian that May's funding pledge was no surprise and was part of an existing and flawed approach to funding home building. Nonetheless, when the Prime Minister told the conference this was the first time housing associations would have long-term certainty about future funding, she was interrupted by a spontaneous round of applause. In part, it was due to the fact that she was there at all. The speech does mark a turnaround in government attitude towards social housing, a shift that started a couple of years ago, when the government finally realized, somewhat belatedly, that it wasn't going to get anything like its target of 300,000 new houses a year built by relying on the private sector. The £2 billion itself feels almost incidental. It's the change in tone, noted the outgoing National Housing Federation chief executive David Orr, that really matters. But will it matter to the people desperate for a stable and secure roof over their heads this winter?